World War II broke out at sea on September 3, 1939, when German submarine U-30, helmed by Oberleutnant Fritz Julius Lemp, sank British passenger liner Athenia, which had been mistaken for an auxiliary cruiser. 6 years later, a torpedo salvo put an end to that war at sea as well. That salvo was launched by US submarine Torsk, commanded by Bafford Llewellyn.
The Mark 28 had a nearly 600-pound warhead.
And these torpedoes would be able to find their way to their target by themselves based on the sound of the enemy's engine noise.
They would try to get off a shot within 1 minute at that target.
And it was with these torpedoes that Torsk was able to sink the last Japanese warship of World War II.
During the 1930s, American shipbuilders closely interacted with the Naval High Command in order to find design solutions for submarines that would satisfy the needs of the Navy. According to the High Naval Command, in order to oppose the Imperial Japanese Navy, which was seen as their main probable enemy, they required submarines capable of operating in vast naval theaters for a long time, up to 60 days, as well as traveling at high speeds when both submerged and surfaced. The habitat conditions and combat performance of submarines were also important. Submarines should be comfortable with their crews so they wouldn't suffer from diminishing combat efficiency and should carry powerful torpedo and artillery armament. Starting in November 1941, Gato-class submarines were commissioned into the US Navy. The optimal combination of characteristics allowed the submarines of that class to fight in the Pacific Ocean effectively throughout the entire war. Baleo-class submarines, an improved version of Gato-class submarines, began entering service in the US Navy in 1942. The main difference compared with their predecessors was a tough hull made of 22.2mm thick carbon alloy steel. The operating diving depth increased to 120 meters thanks to it. The combat deployment experience of the Gato and Baleo submarines required another upgrade of the project that eventually became Tench, named after the lead ship of the series. The new submarine class utilized low-speed propeller electric motors that allowed the engineers to get rid of excessively loud gear reduction units. Rearranging the main ballast tanks enabled an increase to the cruising range and torpedo capacity. These upgrades were initiated by the Naval High Command, which tended to apply high concealment features to US submarines. The reason behind this was that even though the combat initiative in the Pacific theater was on the American side, the Japanese anti-submarine forces remained very strong. Their submarine hunters were equipped with advanced hydroacoustic stations which were capable of detecting submarines at ranges of up to 5 kilometers. Specifications of submarine Torsk 1944. Length 95 meters, beam 8.3 meters, mean draft 5.2 meters, displacement submerged 2,415 tons. The submarine belongs to the double hull type, except for the aft end, which had a single hull design. Maximum diameter of the pressure hull, almost 5 meters. Pressure hull thickness, 22.2 millimeters. The submarine is divided into 8 compartments. Compartments 1 and 8 are torpedo rooms. Compartments 2 and 4 are battery rooms with living accommodation. Compartment 3 is the control post with the conning tower above it. Compartments 5 and 6 are engine rooms. Compartment 7 is an electromechanical room. Armament: 10 533mm torpedo launchers. Ammo capacity: 28 torpedoes.
The torpedoes that Torsk carry were the Mark 27 and Mark 28 acoustic homing torpedoes. These are different than the Mark 14s because the Mark 14s were basically plot a targeting solution to your target, fire them, and hope they detonated on impact. With these were a lot more deadly. Each of these torpedoes was equipped with an acoustic homing sonar that would allow it to be able to home in on the enemy's engine noise.
Artillery armament: 127mm Mark 17 gun, 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft gun, 20mm Oerlikon anti-aircraft autocannon.
The gun crew would be the first members of the ship's complement to be out on deck, and they would try to get off a shot within 1 minute at that target. And if they were good, and if they were lucky, that shot would hit the target, take it by surprise, and take out that enemy vessel. So battle surface was one of the types of tactical evolutions that submarine crews trained for when Torsk was first commissioned in 1945.
Propulsion: 4 Fairbanks Morse diesel engines with total power of 5,400 horsepower. 2 General Electric engines with a total power of 2,740 horsepower. 2 groups of accumulator batteries with 126 elements in each. Maximum speed: surfaced 20 knots, submerged 8.7 knots. Operating diving depth 75 meters, calculated 120 meters. Cruising range 16,000 miles while surfaced at a 10-knot speed. Endurance 75 days. Crew 81 persons.
What about the men in a submarine? What can they do? There are 2 chief means of escape from a sunken submarine: individual, SEA, and collective, the rescue chamber. This film will show conditions in a sunken submarine and how to escape by these 2 methods. This is the after-torpedo room of a sunken submarine. These men are in plenty of trouble, and they know it.
So we are in the forward torpedo room of the USS Torsk, and with additional cruise berthing right here, we also have our escape hatch, which all US submarines were outfitted when they were built in World War II.
Get those mouthpieces between your teeth, open the neck valves, and pull those goggles over your eyes.
How it worked is we have a hatch here through the pressure hull that would allow at least 4 people inside at a time inside of the trunk itself, at which point they would have to close that top hatch and then open the hatch above them to allow water into the escape trunk. Once it was filled with water, they would open the uppermost hatch and swim out while wearing a respirator. And then they would have to be sure to close the top hatch behind them so that the escape trunk can drain of water and the next group of people could enter in order to escape the submarine.
Prepare for individual escape immediately. The first item on the escape bill is to rig the compartment and trunk. Since it's impossible to talk with the mouthpiece between the teeth, the lieutenant must make all his communications by gestures. Here he's signaling for 4 men to break out the inflatable life raft pictured here.
But with a crew of 81 people aboard this vessel, was not really a practical way to get people evacuated. Really was just a peace of mind for submariners.
It looks like the smartest move is to do nothing, just sit here and wait. All right, men, you're all experts in grabbing sack time. Now is the time to prove it. Just lie down and take it easy. Keep the air as pure as possible. Keep the men resting and quiet, and then wait for the rescue chamber.
Fortunately, Torsk's crew didn't have to use that rescue chamber. The submarine was commissioned in December 1944, and she went for her first combat raid on April 15, 1945.
Torsk's first war patrol, which was largely on lifeguard duty, was close to Tokyo Bay and on the eastern side of the big island of Honshu. Torsk's second war patrol, which began in July of 1945, was an offensive patrol where they penetrated the minefields in the Tsushima Straits Torsk had been outfitted with mine-detecting sonar. She was one of the few boats to get this modification before her second war patrol. The mine-hunting sonar that USS Torsk was equipped with, according to Torsk's wartime executive officer, Roy Werthmuller, his recollection was that when this sonar was installed and they trained with it off of Pearl Harbor and then again off of Guam, it was extremely effective in picking up the target mines at a fairly great distance. When they actually got to the area of the Tsushima Strait, there was so much foreign matter in the water, so much krill and other type of marine life, that it actually restricted the effective range of their mine hunting sonar to only a few hundred yards. Roy Werthmuller, in his recollection as executive officer, said it was restricted to the point where it wasn't nearly as effective as it might have been, and he wasn't sure whether it actually helped them get into the Sea of Japan as much as you might think. Fortunately for them, they had a very good idea of where the Japanese minefields were in Tsushima through intelligence data, and that helped a great deal in getting into the Sea of Japan, just as much as having the sonar on board did.
In terms of radioelectronic and hydroacoustic hardware, US Tench-class submarines with Torsk belonging to that class were considered the most advanced in the world at that time. The submarine had onboard radar stations installed for detecting aerial and surface targets, a radio rangefinder, a radio direction finder for determining the direction of enemy radar, and radio reconnaissance stations. The hydroacoustic hardware included a sonar and hydrophone that output information for targeting to the TDC Mark IV automatic torpedo launching system. All that hardware, in addition to the submarine's other systems, required a pretty complex power supply control circuit.
This is the aft maneuvering room on the USS Torsk, and this space wasn't used to maneuver the vessel. Rather, it was used to maneuver where the electricity produced by the electric generators went. How the whole system worked is Torsk has a set of 4 electric batteries. Each of them are attached to an electric generator, and while the submarine was submerged, we would be using electric power to power all the systems and power the engines themselves. So what this space is really for is controlling where the electricity produced by the electric engines and stored in the batteries would go, how much of it would go where. That's what these switches are for, and by maneuvering each switch, you turn the battery on, and then you can use these dials to increase the voltage going to what space and how much of it you need.
On August 11, 1945, after Torsk had successfully avoided the minefields in the Tsushima Strait, she spotted several Japanese civilian sailors floating on the wreckage of a ship that had been destroyed earlier by US aviation. They had spent around 4 days out on the open sea, were suffering from sun exposure, and were very exhausted.
Torsk surfaced, and they were able to send a rubber boat over and bring those six of those Japanese prisoners aboard immediately. A 7th, who was very reluctant at the time, was eventually coaxed to come aboard the vessel. Those 7 Japanese prisoners of war actually were kept aboard the Torsk for the entire war patrol from that point forward, and they were given clothing to wear by members of the Torsk's crew. They ate their meals along with the Torsk crew in the mess deck. They were given jobs on board like helping with preparing meals or cleaning or polishing brightwork. On the morning of August 14th, 1945, Torsk was patrolling in the Sea of Japan, and she picked up a medium-sized Japanese freighter escorted by 1 coastal defense frigate. She fired a Mark 28 acoustic homing torpedo at the escort, which hit the escort vessel and sank it. The freighter then escaped into a nearby port. Later on, around noontime on August 14th, a 2nd Japanese coastal defense frigate, this was frigate number 47, came out looking for this American submarine which had torpedoed the other frigate. Torsk's captain, Commander Llewellyn, fired a Mark 28 acoustic homing torpedo at that vessel. then went into deep submergence, waiting for the explosion. They were afraid that when they didn't hear the explosion that the torpedo had missed, so they fired a Mark 27 acoustic homing torpedo as well. And both torpedoes actually exploded almost simultaneously, taking out Coastal Defense Frigate number 47. Less than 24 hours later, the Japanese agreed to surrender. And so it turned out that Coastal Defense Frigate number 47 was the very last ship to be torpedoed in all of World War II. And the distinction went to the USS Torsk.
The submarine returned to the base on Guam a week after Japan had signed an act of unconditional surrender. Torsk performed just 2 raids during the war, but still managed to mark her name in history. Nevertheless, it was time to bury the hatchet, and speaking about the further destiny of armament and military vehicles that endured after World War II, this catchphrase can be taken literally.
Now the vessels are retired, but kept in condition. Hulls are sandblasted to receive a special paint against corrosion. Below, engines, pumps, air compressors, steering and diving motors are put in perfect working order. Later, the submarine is sealed against air. Deck guns get a coating of special plastic, a cocoon which is airtight and moisture-proof. If needed again, these submarines can be ready in 10 days.
However, it was still too early for the submarine that sunk the last ship in World War II to rest on her laurels in a plastic cocoon. A different fate awaited her.
After World War II, the USS Torsk immediately went into the role of a training submarine in New London, Connecticut. And up until 1955, she was what they called a school boat. And as a school boat at New London, they were basically training American submarine crews and prospective submarine officers in diving procedures and other submarine operations.
The Navy had many submarines like this that were still basically brand new. After World War II, the Navy had required a lot more from their submarines. They wanted submarines that could dive deeper, move more silently, and have a greater endurance than those in World War II. They wanted to be able to carry on the same missions that modern submarines of today use, like carry ballistic missiles. So the Navy had instituted the Guppy Fleet Modernization Program to basically keep these boats updated.
The Guppy program presented an effective means of adjusting the available submarine fleet to the changing conditions of naval warfare. For a relatively small price in the 1950s, the US Navy received 74 submarines that corresponded to the requirements of that time. Together with a small number of diesel-electric submarines of a new design, these submarines formed the core of the American submarine fleet until mass commissioning of nuclear submarines commenced at the beginning of the 1960s. In 1952, Torsk was one of those submarines that underwent some minimal upgrades within this program. The submarine received a new conning tower with a bridge and snorkel.
Torsk is outfitted with a fleet snorkel. This is, of course, from captured German technology, specifically the Type 21 U-boats. And like a snorkel for a person, this allows the submarine to breathe while submerged. Torsk is powered by diesel engines, so what the snorkel is it allows air into the submarine while it's still submerged. Big problem with this system is that it's a big pipe just behind our periscopes, and the water is able to get in because there's a big hole into the boat. So to prevent that, we have a rubber ball that is fixed into the inside of the snorkel, and when the waves come up, pushes that rubber ball inside of the snorkel, preventing water from getting in.
In heavy seas, one of the disadvantages of the snorkel procedure was that the intake head had a flapper valve on the top of it, which would close when the sea broke over top of the snorkel. That caused the engines to immediately pull a temporary vacuum inside the boat, and tended to cause discomfort for the crew because the pressure inside the boat would change. They'd have to clear their eardrums, and it could be rather tiresome if you were snorkeling for any length of time in rough seas.
The Snorkel would gradually become obsolete with the development of nuclear submarines. But at that time, in the 1950s and at the beginning of the 1960s, there was a majority of such submarines as Torsk in the US Navy. They turned out to be quite popular also at the time of probably the most intense episode of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis. In October 1962, Torsk was part of the forces that blocked Cuba. The submarine found herself at the confrontation frontier between two superpowers. During the operation, the submarine dispatched teams to inspect Soviet transport ships several times, and for this, she was eventually awarded the Commendation Medal of the US Navy. After the crisis was resolved, the submarine returned to her usual training activities.
My favorite Torsk story was from 1964, when she was a part of war games in the Pacific. And by that time, Torsk was showing her age as a World War II submarine. And they had a big meeting before the war games with all the captains of all the prospective vessels that were going to be participating, and they gave Torsk's captain a lot of grief. There's no way you're going to get close enough, we will hear you, you're in this rickety old World War II submarine. So the captain leaves that meeting without saying a word. The war games commence, and how Torsk would show that it fired its torpedo at its primary target, which was the aircraft carrier USS Forrestal, was they would launch a poof of purple smoke that everyone would see, so they'd know that a torpedo had been fired at them. The entire war games go through, and there's no poof of purple smoke. So they have a big meeting again at the end, when the captain of Torsk shows up with a big manila folder in his hands. And once again, all the other captains gave him all this grief. They're like, oh, you never got close enough, you didn't even try. We would have gotten you had you tried again. All he did is take this manila folder and throw it down on the table in front of all these captains. And in the side of that folder was a picture of the USS Forrestal, like right off of its bow. And it was totally a mic drop moment, and the captain of Torsk just turned around and left with everyone else in shock.
Torsk herself was decommissioned on March 4th, 1968. She had compiled at that time a very impressive record of 10,668 career dives, a record number of dives mostly attained from her role as a training vessel, where diving was a regular thing that they did all the time to train diving officers. But that number of 10,668 career dives is one of the highest totals of any fleet-type sub, and in fact, any submarine in the US Navy. And it's a record that will never be approached by any of the nuclear subs because they operate so differently, and they dive much less than a diesel-electric sub such as the Torsk.
A very eloquent fact that characterizes the Tench-class submarines is that one of these submarines is still in service. After having served for 27 years, Torsk was excluded from the list of warships of the US Navy in December 1971. In September of the following year, the submarine was transferred to the state of Maryland. Today, the submarine is permanently berthed in the Inner Harbor, the historic port of Baltimore.